All right, thank you very much, Rob, for this introduction. I don't think I've ever had my activities presented in a way that makes them seem like they make sense and lead somewhere. So thank you for that. And then thanks to Christoph and Helmut and the Carson Center in general for having me here, and to Fulbright for paying me while I'm here, and especially just to all of the scholars and staff at the Carson Center who've already given a whole lot of great feedback and support for this project. Okay. Is she here yet, I think? Oh, hi, Christine. Thanks to Christine for kind of helping me survive the dissertation and for helping me cut this thing down to roughly 25 minutes. I think that's it. So I'm going to turn the music off now, but this was playing quietly while we were eating still. It's Schoenberg's Violin Concerto from 1936, an example of his emancipation of the dissonance in music, which I'll briefly talk about later. All right. So for my lecture, which is going to turn to film very shortly, I'm going to start with a poem that I like because I actually study German literature and film. This is a poem by Theodor Storm called Die Stadt, which is usually translated as the town. You could say the city. It describes the poet's home city of Husum on the North Sea in Germany. It's from 1852, long before the films I'm studying, but it's related. The final stanza is probably the most useful. He spends 2 stanzas talking about basically how boring and unremarkable this gray city by the sea is. And then in the final stanza says, "Yet all my heart belongs to you, you gray city by the sea. The magic of youth evermore will rest and smile on you, you gray city by the sea." So there's this really strong sense of kind of backwards emotional attachment and nostalgia attached to this small town on the North Sea. My question going in is just, could you replace Die graue Stadt am Meer with Die graue Stadt am Spree? Could it be the city on the Spree River of Berlin rather than this little town on the North Sea? And I've found a lot of examples that point in that direction. That's sort of the direction of my project. So yeah, within the study of environment and society here at the Carson Center, I'm interested in how humans imagine and represent the relationship between environment and society. So within German literature and film, how do people imagine their place within nature, and how do they imagine a space of home for themselves? In German culture of the past 200 years, questions like this have persistently led back to the term Heimat. No single English word can translate that extremely well. You can roughly translate it as home or rural homeland or a place of belonging. But there's a lot more going on, which you can see in all of the compound words that make use of the term Heimat. If we add the translations for the Heimat portion of this these compound words, you can see it starts with Heimatkunst, Heimatkunde, so arts or history based on a specific local place. You also have Heimatmuseum as a museum that might kind of focus on the farm habits of one very specific town. It can be extremely local and specific. And then you have Heimat literature and Heimat film that are more interested generally in this idea of an idealized rural setting. And then it becomes very abstract in sort of political ideas of Heimatrecht, or after World War II, people speak of Heimatvertriebene. So Heimat becomes equated with political right to citizenship or something like that. Yeah, there are also, of course, lots of political connotations and problems with the word Heimat. By denoting a place where people belong, it's a very short jump to actively excluding other people. So in the Nazi era, Heimat served as one of many terms that sort of generically signified an invented tradition of mythical, nationalist, racist connection to the land. But at the same time, recent environmental historians have also taken a more hopeful look at this notion of Heimat, noting that the way, if you look at this whole list, it includes culture and nature kind of together. And so in thinking of a preservation model that's an alternative to the wilderness ideal that's received a lot of criticism in American environmental writing. This seems like something that's more inclusive in how we think about the natural world. So yeah, that looks at all of the meanings. There's also a few very good recent books that focus more on the political side, the abstract notions of Heimat, and how this was very important in the early days of German unification after 1871 as a way to help people navigate between local identity and a new sense of national identity. In my work, I'm interested more in these top meanings. Heimat is a specific physical place. And that's what I'm looking at in these films. So in terms of the physical space of Heimat, there are a couple of landscapes that play a crucial role in the Heimat discourse of the early 20th century. First, the Alps. The Alps occupy a privileged position in Heimat literature and journals around the turn of the century. For example, Ludwig Ganghofer, a prolific author of Heimat literature, described his novels as Hochlandnovellen, or Alpine novels. And one journal also had the title Hochland, or Highlands. Second, relatedly, the role of the big city. Berlin was seen as the evil other of Heimat. And indeed, one of the mottos of the Heimat movement was Los von Berlin, or like away from Berlin, let's get away from Berlin. At the same time, written discourse and the films I will discuss also find a Heimat in various ways within Berlin. And you can even see that in this motto, Los von Berlin. Note that it's written with a question mark. So the author who wrote the article with that title actually lived in Berlin at the time. And his project wasn't just to get out of the city. It was more to think about how to strengthen his sort of traditional conservative values in spite of the unavoidable fact of urbanization. In another example from the opposite end of the political spectrum, a late 19th century writer whose work is described here, he describes the workers' movement in Berlin as a sort of emotional Heimat, a seelische Heimat, for workers who traveled to Berlin from the countryside. Right. So much for the discourse of Heimat. This is a really huge field. There are a lot of books about it, and it's one I'm just sort of getting into right now, but it's also necessary background for what I'm getting into. So I'm now going to turn to some of my film examples. I will start with the mountains, and then I'll move on to the cities. And at the end, I'll briefly discuss environments of Nazi film that come after the hybrid environments I'm studying in the Weimar Republic. My argument going in is that Weimar film brings the countryside into the city, and at the same time exports the city to the country visually. These film environments represent a moment of what I'm thinking of as dissonant environmental hybridity before the Gleichschaltung, before the orchestration of film culture under the Nazi era. So mountain films. As we saw, mountains played an important role for Heimat discourse. But in Weimar film, some of the most important and popular images of the Alps actually show the mountains in a way that imagines them as industrialized and seemingly creates the opposite of the rural Heimat idea. So this is Arnold Fanck. He is he's sort of the founding director, not necessarily the most popular director of mountain films. This genre of mountain film is sort of seen as a curiosity of German film history. They were extremely popular in the Weimar Republic, however. There were mountain films that came out pretty much every year between 1920 and 1940, and they weren't sort of fringe nature enthusiast things the way you'd see now with mountain film festivals. They were mass entertainment. The leading director of the genre, Arnold Fanck, is often cited as a precursor to Heimat films. He portrays rural spaces as an antidote to the corruption and the complexity that people saw in modern life in the cities. He also trained as actors two people who became some of the most successful filmmakers, film directors in the Nazi era, Leni Riefenstahl and Louis Trenker. And because of that, his films are often also studied for their political implications. But for now, I'm focusing on environmental implications that I see in his films, specifically on their links to ski tourism. And through looking at the ski industry in relation to these films, I argue that they offer another link to this idea of urban Heimat. So people often state that Fank's films played an important role in the growth of the ski industry. Yet his films don't simply show scenes of skiing, they manipulate them, they choose and edit how skiing is shown. And the result is skiing that looks very different on film than what was actually happening on the mountains during the Weimar era. Just kind of while I talk, I'll play a scene from one of these films. This is from the English version of The Holy Mountain, Der Heilige Berg, which is a 1926 film that incidentally starred Leni Riefenstahl and Louis Trinker. And that's what's usually talked about in it. This film, and the sequence we're watching right now, is a 10-minute scene that shows a ski race. The ski race is described in the German subtitles as a Dauerlauf, and in the English subtitles it's translated as a long-distance race. This kind of race is fairly unfamiliar now, at least as far as I know skiing, but it was actually a major event back then. And to think of them as downhill races would just miss the mark. As an example, in 1906 there was a race called the Arlberg Rennen that happened several years in a row. The race in 1906 required competitors to cover 16.5 kilometers on skis, during which time they had to climb uphill for a total of 1,140 meters. So the total time spent would probably be more climbing than actually descending. However, in this long-distance run that we see in the Holy Mountain, almost the entire time is spent showing skiers speeding downhill. Now and then you see flat cross-country sections, but it's mostly for sort of humorous variation. You see someone really struggling, and so they're shown going uphill, and then everyone else is shown again zooming downhill. Yeah, so despite the label as a long-distance event, what we're actually seeing is a focus on downhill skiing and all about speed. Yeah, we can stop this. So in making the films, Arnold Fanck uses editing to focus on the speedy descent. But in actually building physical ski resorts, this is much more difficult. The ski tourism industry could only really get this focus on downhill skiing by basically building machines to make the uphill part of skiing much easier. And this had not happened yet. The first tow lifts were installed in this region in 1937. The first chair lifts came after the war. So in film here, Arnold Fanck is actually imagining a type of skiing that wouldn't exist in real life for years afterwards. But his films do interact sort of intertextually with the ski industry at that time. As we see in these ski brochures from the 1930s, the way the ski industry represented itself is actually very similar to the way that Arnold Fanck imagined skiing on films. Both the films and the advertising brochures emphasize the speed and the power of skiing, focusing on sort of strong bodies and really angular formal layouts, while excluding from the image any infrastructure that would bring the people uphill to make that speed possible. We might say then that Arnold Fanck did indeed serve as a great supporter of the sport of skiing, but not of skiing as it existed when he made the film. His films, in fact, portray the mountains as a site of constant mechanized motion, an environment infused with the speed and convenience of industrial modernity. So it's a film fantasy that would be realized by the powered lifts that became widespread in the decades afterwards. To return to my theme of Heimat, in these films, the motion of the city is transplanted to the mountains. And so a key trait of urban space with this mechanized speed becomes merged with one of the fundamental images that we know from Heimat discourse. So to continue with my study of Heimat in Weimar film, of urban Heimat. I'm turning to what initially seems like the polar opposite of Heimat, and of course is central to my idea, which is the big city. Several important Weimar films show incursions of the countryside into the city, and I will discuss a few examples of these. These films build on physical changes to Berlin's landscape, emphasizing how new tourist sites and transport infrastructure were transforming Berlin in the late 1920s. But the result is not an ever denser urban center. Instead, what we see on film here is an urban landscape that seems to contain its rural counterpart. To start, I want to take a brief look at Walter Ruttmann's 1927 film, Berlin, the Symphony of a Metropolis, Die Symphonie der Großstadt. It's perhaps the most famous Weimar city film, and alongside Vertov's Man with a Movie Camera is one of the most famous city films of all time. This is a scene that happens near the end of the film. This scene shows the Berlin Sports Palace in 1927. And here we actually see snowshoeing and in a moment skiing inside the city. In fact, in 1927, when this film was made, the world's first indoor ski hill was constructed inside Berlin's Sport Palace. Now, when I first saw this scene, when I first noticed it, which you don't really notice it when you first watch the movie because it just happens in sort of a nightlife sequence, and you're watching the dancers, and then there's something else, and then there are more jazz bands and stuff. But when I noticed the skiing thing, I became very excited, and I thought this is totally an example of how the city is so dynamic that it can transform the city, the urban space to also include the mountains, and this is great. However, the film is complicated. It celebrates the dynamic transformations and movement possible in the city, certainly, and this is what most people write about when they talk about this film. But it also fetishizes technology in a way that really points towards Nazi technological propaganda, and some of that propaganda was actually made by Walter Ruttmann. Also, Ruttmann, the film director here, later made several other Nazi films, including one called Blood and Soil and one called Old Germanic Farming Culture, which both very much celebrated rural farming life as this polar opposite of the evil, corrupt city. So based on that, the skiing in this film is certainly interesting, but building some sort of environmental argument only on this film would be problematic. So I'm going to move on. But if we look back, a predecessor of Ruttmann's film that is commonly cited as, for a lot of similarities, is Laszlo Moholy-Nagy's sketch, Dynamik der Großstadt. I call it a sketch because he composed this as the manuscript that should have been made into a film in 1921 or 22, but he couldn't find a producer who was willing to risk the experimental project, and so the film was never made. He did publish the manuscript in the 8th book of this series, Bauhaus Books, in 1925. Moholy-Nagy was actually teaching at the Bauhaus, and he co-designed this series with Walter Gropius in the 20s. Although it was never produced as a film, this manuscript is often cited in relation to Ruttmann's film, and they share a lot of motifs. Both include a focus on motor vehicle traffic, point of view shots from moving vehicles. Of course, this isn't actually a film, but it has sort of arrows describing the angles of movement that we want, and different frames laid out also in really interesting visual ways on the page. But you can compare that to the moving vehicles, the contrasting angles and directions of motion that you see in Ruttmann's film. He also includes zoo animals that we see also in Ruttmann, as well as popular performing artists and indeed skiers. You can see the skiers here in the center of this image. Although this is discussed a lot, nobody's pointed out the skiers as a connection. I think because nobody really notices the skiers in Ruttmann's film, just because you don't, unless you're watching for them. But they actually happen in roughly the same place. This happens on page 13 of a 14-page manuscript in the film by Ruttmann. It's about 3 or 5 minutes before the end of an hour-long movie. And they're both within the context of urban entertainment. Here it's surrounded by circus animals, acrobats, and another way really of bringing nature into the city, I guess, also as animals. But both frame skiing within the context of urban entertainment. The images here are taken from an instructional book on skiing called Das Wunder des Schneeschuhs, or The Miracle of Skiing, roughly, which in fact was written by the very same Arnold Fanck who directed those films we were watching a moment ago. Fanck used film strips from an earlier skiing movie in this book to teach people how to ski, and then Mohainach took images from that book to use in his film sketch. So by using these images, Mohainach seems to appreciate the mechanized aesthetics that form the core of Fanck's ski films. Both Fanck's films and Mohainach's sketch and inclusion of them reveal an underlying affinity between the speed of skiing, which is pre-industrial but still inherently technological, and the industrialized tempo of the metropolis. So although this skiing scene is contextualized within urban entertainment, what is actually shown is very different than what we see in Ruttmann's film. You can see this better here. It's clearly an image from the mountains. You see tracks in the snow. There's sort of deep snow with only a couple of tracks in them. Strong backlighting. He's silhouetted against the sun. Clearly, we are outdoors. There's no question that this is something like a staged scene, like what we saw in the movie. And as a final observation, if you look closely at the two images, you see he's turning that way, and in the top image, he's actually farther into the turn. So these two images are reversed. The top image is actually the bottom image from the film strip in Arnold Fanck's film. You can see that here, and we can also know that this was deliberate because in the same book where this film manuscript was published, he also includes these film strips. This is a book kind of about the future of visual media, and he uses this as an example of how film can be printed in print form as an educational tool. And you can see if you look closely down here, he cut a picture off, and up here he also cut a picture off. And those are the two images that we just saw a moment ago. Clearly, he knew what he was doing, and he switched the order. So he draws on Fanck's images that already contain this strong sense of mechanized motion, and he further emphasizes their technological aspects by reassembling them in reverse order as part of his own film project. So Mohainach focuses on the visual contrasts possible through film and photography. Ruttmann focuses on the physical buildings in Berlin, showing the new indoor ski hill that was built in the Sports Palace. But both works show how Weimar-era Berlin brings in the mountains that are so familiar from Heimat iconography into the city. And there's one final example that I'm just going to mention, but not go into in any detail. The 1930 film Menschen am Sonntag, or People on Sunday, focuses on the rural spaces just outside of Berlin. While this space is much more accessible than the Alps in our previous examples, this film portrays the forests and lakeshore of the Wannsee region in a way that seems to fold them directly inside the middle of the city. There are lots of sequences that I don't have time to analyze right now, but that are edited in a way that, for example, show a transportation film within a transportation sequence within the city, and then suddenly you're on the lake, or the reverse. It's similar to what Fanck's doing. It uses visual editing to sort of manipulate the sense of space and bring the country into the city. So this is the last of the films that I'm discussing. What I've done here in the past few minutes is a set of close analyses or interpretations to demonstrate my idea of urban Heimat as I've thought of it so far. I have a few more films in mind that I want to use for the dissertation, both from the Weimar and the Nazi eras. But my hope is not just to offer a new interpretation of a few specific films, but rather to explore broader trends within environmental fantasies that we see on film in the Weimar and Nazi eras and how they might differ. For this broader project, my plan in the coming months is to switch gears and scan a large number of films from before and after 1933. And my hope is that this will give broad-scale evidence to support my hypothesis on the changes between film environments in those eras. So moving towards a conclusion. In all of this, my goal is not to celebrate Weimar cinema or Weimar culture in general as some sort of environmental utopia. I'm fully aware that there were lots of problematic notions in Weimar environmental thought. Perhaps most notably the arch-conservative ideas of pristine nature and beautiful human bodies that sort of merged together and fed very easily into Nazi racism. Perhaps the most famous example is the Weimar culture film Paths to Strength and Beauty, which was then pretty much directly quoted by Leni Riefenstahl in some of her Nazi-era films. But in fact, this uneasy coexistence of something like Mohoy Nach's urban experimental film project with the conservative healing through nature idea we get here, this is exactly the point. The film environments of urban Heimat, as I'm calling them, exist within a dissonant collection of imagined environments in Weimar film. The shift to Nazi cinema is marked not by a decreased focus on the natural world, or even a decrease in overlaps between rural and urban spaces. It's more a question of tone and of style. In Nazi cinema, although there were still many different types of films and environments on film, they were funneled through the propaganda ministry, fitting into what has been called the orchestra principle. Goebbels describes the propaganda value of mass media as being like an orchestra, in that many different instruments are played, and they sound very different, but they all contribute to the same symphony. They all contribute to the same message. And we can safely assume that this metaphorical symphony is marked by consonance and not by discord. And that is why I started today with Arnold Schoenberg's music and with his notion of the emancipation of the dissonance within music. In the transition from Weimar film to Nazi film, I argue that what is lost might be described as the diversity of film environments in Weimar, marked by a sort of emancipated environmental dissonance. And with that, I'm finished. So thank you, and I look forward to our discussion.